for the chandeliers. A champagne glass pointed at the notary like a verdict. The room smiled because she looked small. Then the heir turned toward the signature she refused. What kind of truth makes proud people suddenly grow quiet? The champagne flute in Vivian Price's hand caught the chandelier light just as Clara Whitcomb reached the edge of the ballroom. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Not the musicians tucked beneath the balcony, the rows of white flowers climbing the banisters. Not the polished floor shining under 100 careful shoes. It was that glass, thin-stemmed and perfect, lifted between Vivian's fingers as if it had been made only to point, dismiss, and wound. Clara stopped beside the small table where the donation papers had been arranged for signatures. She kept her folder pressed against her waist. The blue dress she wore was clean and modest, but under the weight of so many silk gowns and black jackets, it felt suddenly cheap. She had not come as a guest. She had come because someone from the Ashford house had called the county office and asked for a notary assistant to confirm documents before the charity auction closed. That was all. Finish the paperwork. Stay polite. That. Leave before anyone remembered her face. She had nearly managed it until Vivian saw her. "Well," Vivian said, turning from a circle of guests with a smile that never reached her eyes. "They really do let anyone in on Derby Eve now." Few people nearby gave the soft, careful laugh of people who had not decided yet whether cruelty was safe. Clara lowered her eyes to the papers. There were donation forms, transfer acknowledgments, sheets with blank lines waiting for names that carried weight in the county. Martin Keene's neat legal tabs marked the places where signatures were required. Everything looked orderly. Too orderly, perhaps. Clara had learned not to distrust a document until the paper gave her a reason. Vivian crossed the space with that smooth confidence wealthy women sometimes wore like perfume. Her gown was a deep green, enough to look almost black when she passed beneath the shadow of the balcony. The champagne in her glass trembled only slightly. "You're the Whitcomb girl, aren't you?" Vivian asked. "June's granddaughter." Clara lifted her chin. "Yes, Mom." "Oh, don't mom me. You'll make me feel ancient." Vivian laughed again, and this time the people around her joined more quickly. "I remember your grandmother. She used to know exactly which silver tray went with which room. Wonderful woman, quiet, useful." The last word landed lightly, almost sweetly. That made it worse. Clara felt heat crawl up her neck. Her hands stayed still on the folder. June had taught her that silence could be a door or a wall, depending on how you held it. Clara chose the wall. "I'm here for the documents," she said. "Of course you are." Vivian looked her over, from the plain shoes to the blue dress and back to the folder. "And I suppose the county sent you because you're so very good with signatures." At the far side of the table, Keene adjusted his cuffs without looking directly at Clara. He was smiling the way lawyers smiled when they wanted the room calm and the paperwork moving. His silver pen lay beside the top document, placed at a perfect angle. Clara noticed that too. She noticed small things, pens, pauses, the pressure of a hand on paper. The way older people looked toward the door before signing something they did not want to sign. Vivian stepped closer, lowering her voice, just enough to sound intimate while still letting the nearest guests hear. "You know, dear, Finina, there's a difference between being careful and making trouble because you don't understand how families like this handle private matters." The words were soft. The threat beneath them was not. Clara's fingers tightened once around the folder. Inside it were standard stamps, forms, and the small notes she carried for herself, the ones no one at the office had ever asked to see, notes about dates, hesitations, signatures that leaned differently than before. She had never shown them to anyone. She had only kept them because forgetting felt worse than fear. Across the room, Nathan Ashford stood near the foot of the curved staircase, moved since Clara entered. Tall, controlled, and dressed as if every thread chosen by who understood old money, he watched the room without seeming to belong to its laughter. Clara knew who he was. Everyone in that county knew the Ashford name. When horses land, charity boards, a mother rarely seen in public anymore, and Vivian. Soon enough, if the whispers were true, Vivian turned slightly, making sure Nathan could see her smile. I only worry, she said, that a girl who spends her days behind a county desk might mistake hesitation for principle. That one stung. Clara looked down at the donation papers. Her job was not to defend her dress, her grandmother, or the sound of her own country vowels, in a room trained to smooth every edge. Her job was to confirm names, witness signatures, and refuse when something was wrong. That last part mattered most. I don't notarize hesitation, said quietly. I notarize willingness. The small ring of listeners went still. Vivian's smile sharpened. How noble. Martin finally lifted his eyes. Miss Whitcomb. Perhaps we should proceed with the documents at hand. Yes, Clara said. That would be best. She reached for the top page, but Vivian did not move away. The champagne glass hovered between them like a polished little weapon. You must forgive me, Vivian said to the guests, though her eyes remained on Clara. Some people get one small duty and start imagining themselves guardians of the kingdom. Another laugh rose, weaker this time. Clara felt it press against her skin. She could leave. He could set down the folder, tell Martin the papers were not ready, and walk out past the flowers and the music and the staring faces. No one would stop her. No one would miss her. Then Nathan spoke. Vivian, raise his voice. He did not need to. The sound moved through the ballroom. With the quiet weight of a door closing, Vivian turned, still smiling, but the brightness in her face tightened. Nathan, darling, was only teasing. Nathan crossed the floor slowly. The guest shifted aside before he reached them. He did not look at Vivian first. He looked at Clara, then at the folder in her hands, then at Martin's tabs on the donation papers. You're Clara Whitcomb. He said, Yes, you work with county records. I assist with notarizations and filings. And last month, Nathan said, his expression unreadable, used to notarize a power of attorney for my mother. The ballroom seemed to lose its music all at once. Clara heard one chair scrape softly behind her. Martin's hand closed over his pen. Vivian laughed. There was no ease left in it. Nathan, this is hardly the time. It is exactly the time, he said. Clara's throat went dry. She had imagined being questioned someday in an office, perhaps by a supervisor, perhaps by Martin, with his polished voice and careful threats. Imagined, standing in the Ashford ballroom with half the county, watching, while Nathan asked about Eleanor Ashford as if the answer might change the floor beneath them. I followed procedure, Clara said. Isn't what I asked. Vivian's face changed then, just slightly. Not enough for the room to see. Enough for Clara. Nathan took one step closer, still not warm, still not rescuing her, but no longer looking past her as everyone else had. Why, he asked, did you refuse to notarize my mother's power of attorney? For a moment, no one in the ballroom moved. The music had not stopped, not completely, it thinned into something distant and useless, as if the musicians themselves had begun listening. Clara felt every eye shift from Nathan to her, then from her to the folder, held tight against her middle. Vivian's champagne glass hovered near her lips. Forgotten there. Martin Keene's hand remained on his pen. Clara knew the safe answer. She could say there had been a procedural concern. She could say the document needed review. He could tuck the truth behind office language until everyone in the room was comfortable again. But Nathan was not asking for comfort. I had concerns, she said. Vivian gave a small laugh. Concerns. How official, and did not look at her. What kind? Clara drew in one slow breath. The signature did not match earlier records, and Mrs. Ashford seemed uncertain about what she was being asked to sign. His pen clicked once against the table. Miss Whitcomb may be overstating her authority. I'm not making a legal ruling, Clara said, keeping her voice even. I'm saying what I witnessed. Nathan's eyes stayed on her, and his face softened, but something in the air changed. The humiliation of the ballroom was still there, still hot on Clara's skin, but now it had a different shape. It was no longer just about her dress, her accent, Vivian's smile. It was about a paper no one wanted discussed in public. Nathan turned slightly. The study, Vivian's smile vanished for half a second. Nathan, the auction, can wait, the injate. He walked away from the table without asking Clara to follow. That should have annoyed her. Instead, she found herself moving, because the alternative was staying there under Vivian's polished little knife. The study was just off the main hall, small by Ashford standards, but still larger than Clara's living room. The door closed behind them with a soft, final sound. The noise of the party became muffled. On the desk, a stack of old folders has already been arranged with neat paper tabs. Martin had either expected them to be needed or feared they would be. That detail made Clara's stomach tighten. Nathan stood on the other side of the desk. "Show me." Clara did not sit. "I need to be clear. I'm not an attorney. I know what you are." "No," she said, and the word surprised even her. "You know where I work." "That's not the thing." For the first time that evening, and looked unsettled, only slightly, only in the way his jaw held too still. Clara opened the folder nearest her and found copies of Eleanor Ashford's older records. Donation forms, stable agreements, a few estate documents. You need to understand every legal purpose behind them. She was looking for the human mark inside the ink. She pointed to one signature. "This one is older. See how the E begins?" She presses hard at the start and lightens near the end. Nathan leaned closer, but his arms remained crossed. "People's handwriting changes." "Yes. With age, illness, medication, a bad day. That's why one difference isn't enough." Clara turned another page. Here and here. Same habit. Her last name rises a little, then drops after the H. She finishes slowly, but she knows where she's going. Nathan said nothing. Clara took out the page she had refused. "This one doesn't do that. Farts weak, then presses hard in the middle, like someone guided the hand after the first stroke." And there was another issue. "What?" She looked at Mr. Keene before answering me. Not once. Several times, Nathan's eyes flicked to the door, as if Martin might be standing on the other side. "I asked her if she understood the document," Clara said. "She said she was tired." Mr. Keene said she had already agreed, the same as willingness. The word sat between them, plain and heavy. Nathan took the page from her and stared at it for so long, Clara began to feel the old fear returning. He was an Ashford, then. She was June Whitcomb's granddaughter, a county assistant in a borrowed corner of his house, telling him his family lawyer had pushed too hard around his mother. At last he said, "My mother has bad days. I believe that. He forgets things. I believe that too." He looked up, then, sharper. "Then you understand why someone might need to handle matters for her." Clara closed the folder with care. Handling matters is not the same as taking her voice. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Nathan looked as if she had struck something he had spent a long time protecting. The next day, white light hung over the Ashford land in a pale gold wash. Nathan drove Clara in silence past black fences, open fields, and horses that lifted their heads as the car passed. The big house disappeared behind them. Ahead, a stand of old trees, sat the smaller cottage where Eleanor lived. Clara had expected nurses, locked doors, a room arranged around decline. Instead, Eleanor sat near the front window, with a folded blanket over her knees and a stack of old photographs beside her. She looked fragile in the way. Fine china looked fragile. Not because it had susra ink, because one careless hand could still do damage. Nathan stopped just inside the room. "Mother." Eleanor turned her head. Her eyes found Clara first. "You were the girl who would not stamp that paper," she said. Clara's throat tightened. "Yes, Mom." "Good." Eleanor's hand moved over the blanket, searching. Nathan stepped forward, but she waved him off before he reached her. "Everything that is put in front of a person deserves a name on it." Nathan's face changed, but he kept quiet. Clara sat when Eleanor nodded toward the chair. She took out the copies slowly, not like an accusation, like a trap. "Mrs. Ashford, I need to ask only what you're comfortable answering. I am comfortable with my own name." The answer was thin, but it held. Clara placed two signatures side by side on the small table. Eleanor looked at them for a long moment. Her fingers trembled when she lifted one page, but her gaze stayed clear. "That one is mine," she said. "That one is trying to be." Nathan inhaled through his nose. Clara did not look at him. She watched Eleanor. Do you remember what the paper was about? Clara asked. Eleanor's eyes shifted toward the window, toward the fields beyond it. They said it would make things easier. They always say that when they want the old to be quiet. Her voice roughened, but she did not stop. My husband left instructions for the south pasture and the mare barn. Nothing sold without my say. Me out to the horses while I was breathing. Nathan Thin's hand tightened on the back of a chair. Eleanor looked at him then, and the room seemed to grow smaller around them. I forget names sometimes, forget whether I took my tea. I do not forget the land your father asked me to guard. For the first time since Clara had met him, and looked less like the owner of the room than a son who had arrived too late to hear something important. Mother, he said quietly. But no apology came after it. Not yet. Maybe he did not know how to build one. Eleanor lowered the paper back to the table and placed one finger beneath the false signature. I did not write that freely. Clara felt the fear inside her shift. It did not disappear. It became steadier, heavier, than she could carry with both hands. This was no longer about whether she had overstepped at a county desk. This was about a woman being carefully moved out of her own life. Nathan stared at the page, then at his mother. Color drained from his face in slow degrees. In that quiet cottage, with the party gowns and polished laughter far behind them, he finally understood that the person he had doubted was not Clara. It was himself. That afternoon, Clara had spread 3 neat piles of paper across June's kitchen table, and still could not make herself touch the fourth. The was small, warm, and worn in the way honest homes often were. Kettle sat cooling on the stove. June's old wall clock ticked above the doorway. Outside, the Ashford fields lay somewhere beyond the low hills, green and beautiful and suddenly less like land than a thing being taken apart one signature at a time. June stood at the sink with her arms folded, watching her granddaughter pretend she was only organizing papers. Read that same page 4 times. June said. Clara looked down. It was one of her own notes from the day Eleanor's power of attorney had been refused. Careful handwriting. No accusation. No drama. The small facts she had trusted enough to keep and not to tee up and feared enough to hide. She knew, Clara said. Mrs. Ashford knew that signature wasn't freely given. June dried her hands on a towel. I could have told you that, no. Clara looked up. Her grandmother did not soften the words. June had never been a woman who wrapped hard truths in lace. Eleanor started getting left out of decisions months before that paper showed up. Fame and went from that house. Vivian smiled through every one of it. Martin carried folders like a preacher carries a Bible. And Eleanor? She was moved farther and farther from the rooms where things were decided. Clara's chest tightened. Why didn't you say something? To who? June asked. The family lawyer? The fiancé? The son who wouldn't look long enough to see what was happening. Her voice did not rise, but it grew rough at the edges. People like us get called loyal when we keep quiet, and troublesome when we remember too much. Clara looked back at the papers. Her fear had a shape now. If she stepped forward and failed, Ian could make her look bitter. Martin could make her look reckless. The county could decide she had overstepped. June could be dragged into it because she had once worked in that house and still knew where its dust settled. Theon, I don't want them turning on you, Clara said. June came to the table and pulled out the chair across from her. From the pocket of her sweater, she took a small, bent notebook with a faded cover. She laid it beside Clara's notes. This is mine, June said. Dates I visited. What Eleanor remembered. What she forgot. Who was in the room. Who didn't want her talking. Clara stared at it. Grandma kept it because I'm old enough to know that memory is powerful only if somebody writes it down. The notebook felt heavier than it looked when Clara opened it. June's handwriting was plain and steady. There were no accusations, the entries. Eleanor clear about South Pasture. Eleanor upset after Martin visit. Vivian says rest is best. Nathan not present. Eleanor asks why papers moved from desk. A quiet anger rose in Clara, hot enough to make her careless, but strong enough to hold her upright. Later that day, Nathan met them in a small room off the Ashford stable office. He wore no party smile, no public face. He looked tired. Clara could see that the tiredness was not from lack of sleep alone. It came from having to look at a truth he had helped avoid. June placed her notebook on the table, without ceremony. Read it, if you're ready to stop being proud. Nathan accepted the blow. He opened the notebook. Clara watched him move from page to page. He did not argue. That made it worse somehow. A man like Nathan could fight a public insult, and he could dismiss gossip. But this was June's plain record of days. He had not been there. When he reached the entry about the south pasture, his hand stopped. "What is it?" Clara asked, and stood and walked to a cabinet near the far wall. He unlocked it and removed a folder marked with Martin's tabs. His movements were controlled, but his face had gone pale. "There is a signing scheduled," he said, "for next month, not after the wedding." Soon, Clara felt the room narrow around the table. "For what?" Nathan opened the folder and turned it toward her. She did not understand every line, and she did not pretend to. He understood enough. Transfer language, estate authority, a parcel description tied to Ashford land, approval lines prepared in advance, and tucked behind the formal pages, half hidden by a cover sheet, the evaluation Clara had not seen before. She read it once. Then again, this says Mrs. Ashford was able to express a consistent preference about her property. Nathan's jaw tightened and told me the evaluation was inconclusive. June let out a short breath through her nose. Of course he did. Clara looked from the evaluation to June's notebook, then to her own notes. Separate pieces. Small, careful pieces. Together, they no longer looked like worry. They looked like a path. Nathan pressed both hands on the table. "Vivian will say you're misreading it." "She already has," Clara said. "Martin will say you have no authority. Have authority over the estate." Clara gathered the papers, aligning their edges with hands that shook only slightly. "But I know what I witnessed. I know what your mother said, Beyond. And I know this evaluation should not have been hidden." Nathan looked at her then, and for the first time she saw the choice forming before he made it. His family name stood on one side. His mother's voice stood on the other, only to sound. Clara could not make him cross that distance. She could only make sure the truth was waiting there when he did. By evening, the signing room had been prepared, as if nothing in the world were wrong. The table gleamed. Documents sat in a clean stacks. Vivian stood near Martin in a pale dress, smiling with the calm confidence of someone already picturing herself, mistress of every room. When Clara entered, conversation thinned. Vivian's eyes found the folder in Clara's arms. "You must be lost again." Clara did not answer. She walked to the table. June followed a step behind her, quiet but steady. Nathan stood near the far end of the room, motionless, and smile was polite and cold. "Miss Whitcomb, this is a private family matter." It became something else, Clara said, when Mrs. Ashford's willingness was put on paper without her voice. Vivian laughed softly. "There it is, the little county girl with a grand speech." Clara opened the folder. One by one, she placed the copied signatures on the table. Then June's notebook, then the hidden evaluation. The room went still. Then, Clara kept her hand on the last page so it would not slide across the polished wood. She did not look at Vivian. She looked at Nathan, and in that breathless silence, with every prepared signature waiting, then had to decide whether he would stand where he had always stood, or step to the side of the woman everyone had tried to dismiss. The silence, after Clara laid the papers down, did not break all at once. Fine. It spread through the signing room, slowly, from the guests nearest the polished table to the people gathered by the doorway, until even Vivian's practiced smile seemed too loud for the room. Clara kept her hand on the hidden evaluation, the last page in the stack, because it was the page Martin Keene had never meant anyone to see. Martin recovered first. "This is inappropriate," he said, his voice smooth enough to sound almost kind. "Miss Whitcomb has no authority to interrupt a private signing." Clara felt the old shame rise, quick and hot. The little county girl, the granddaughter of the help, the woman who knew just enough paperwork to be dangerous and not enough status to be believed, Vivian stepped forward as if she had been waiting for that exact opening. Nathan, darling, this is embarrassing. She has been trying to make herself part of this family's business from the moment she walked into this house. Clara did not look at Vivian. She looked at Nathan. He had not moved. For one awful second, thought that would be the answer. The Ashford silence. The old habit of letting prettier, louder people arrange the truth. June stood behind her, close enough that Clara could feel the steadiness of her presence. Even June could not make Nathan choose. Then Eleanor's voice came from the chair near the end of the table. I would like to see the page. Vivian's head turned sharply. Eleanor, you're tired. No, Eleanor said. I am old. There is a difference. The words were thin, but the room heard them. Clara lifted the evaluation and carried it to her. She placed it carefully in Eleanor's hands, along with the page bearing the disputed signature. Eleanor looked at both for a long moment. Her fingers trembled, but her eyes did not wander. The room waited, as if breath itself had become impolite. That is my name, Eleanor said, touching the false signature. It is not my consent. Martin's face tightened. Mrs. Ashford, with respect, the matter is more complicated than that. Eleanor looked at him then. For a moment, the frail woman in the chair disappeared behind the old mistress of the farm. It became complicated when you decided my weakness was more useful than my wishes. A murmur moved through the room. Vivian's glass was not in her hand anymore, but Clara could still see it in the way she held herself, polished and cutting. This is absurd. She forgets things. Nathan knows that. Nathan finally lifted his head. Yes, he said. He forgets things. Vivian's mouth softened with relief too soon. Nathan stepped away from the far end of the room and came to stand beside his mother. Not beside Vivian, not beside Martin, beside Eleanor, close enough to Clara that the choice could not be mistaken. But I forgot more, he said. I forgot to ask her what she wanted. Clara felt something loosen inside her, not enough to make her knees steady, to let her breathe. Martin reached for the top document. Nathan, I strongly advise. No, Nathan said. The word was not loud, but it cut cleanly through every prepared page on that table. He picked up the stack of sale documents and turned them face down. There will be no signing today. The land sale is suspended. Any authority connected to my mother's property will be reviewed by someone outside this house. Vivian stared at him. You cannot humiliate me like this in front of everyone. Nathan looked at her with a sadness that had no warmth left in it. You were willing to take my mother's voice in front of everyone. Face changed then. The charm slipped first, then the confidence. What remained was anger, plain and frightened. Martin tried once more. This is a family matter. June gave a dry laugh from behind Clara. Funny how folks call it family when the papers are against them. No one laughed, but several people looked down at the table, and that was enough. By nightfall, the guests had gone. The flowers still stood in their arrangements, touched and expensive, but the room no longer belonged to Vivian. Martin left with his briefcase closed tight against his side, and within days, people who knew how to read old files began asking him questions he could not charm away. The sale stopped. The estate access he had guarded so carefully was taken from him. Vivian's engagement ended before another invitation could be printed, and the doors that had opened for her because of the Ashford name began closing one by one. None of it felt like victory at first. Fizzin' sound. Eleanor returned to the small cottage under the trees, not as someone being put away, but as someone choosing where she wished to live. Nathan had the South Pasture records brought to her there, and when any paper needed her name, came with time, explanation, and room for her to say no. He did not ask forgiveness in a grand speech. He came back in smaller, harder ways. He listened, he waited, he learnt the shape of his mother's wishes without rushing to manage them. Clara visited once with June, carrying a folder under one arm, and a pie wrapped in a dish towel under the other. Eleanor signed a simple stable note that afternoon, slowly and firmly. When she finished, she looked at Clara. Is that one mine? She asked. Clara smiled. Yes, Mom. Every letter, It was the closest thing to a blessing she had ever received from that house. Weeks later, on a quiet street near the courthouse, Clara unlocked the door to a narrow little office with clean windows and second-hand chairs. The outside, the sign was modest. It did not promise miracles. It simply told older people they could bring their papers there and be heard before they signed anything away. June stood beside her on the sidewalk, arms folded, pretending not to be proud. Nathan came after the first hour, carrying a small box of files from Eleanor for Clara to review when she had time. He paused at the doorway, not stepping in as if he owned the space. "You did this," he said. Clara looked around at the plain desk, the waiting chairs, the fresh pens lined in a cup. For most of her life, rooms like the Ashford Ballroom had taught her where she did not belong. This room asked nothing from her, except that she keep her hands steady and her conscience awake. "No," she said softly. "We stopped one wrong thing. This is what comes after." That afternoon, first woman through Clara's door was gray-haired, nervous, and clutching an envelope with both hands. Clara rose to meet her, pulled out a chair, and placed a pen on the desk between them. Not in front of herself, in front of the woman. "Take your time," Clara said. And for once, the signature could wait until the person holding the pen was ready.